We are born free.
And we will die free.
The time in between, though,
that's complicated.
In that time, governments, institutions, and our egos will limit our ability to find true freedom in this life. These are real stories of real people overcoming the odds, persevering in justice, and unlocking their potential. Welcome to Finding Freedom. Here's your host, John Odermatt.
Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Finding Freedom right here on the Lions of Liberty podcast. And I'm excited, guys, excited for this episode. We're going to be talking with Doug Stuart. I was on Doug's show a little while ago. He's the CEO of the Christian Libertarian Institute. We'll introduce Doug in just a moment here. Before we do that, there's a couple things that I want to speak with you all about. Y'all, what am I, Southern or something? I should be saying yins. I'm in Pittsburgh, but I don't say yins because I went to college. No, I'm just kidding. Nothing wrong with people saying yins. Anyway, so I wanted to talk to you about my friend Christian Bates and his company, Longevity Power. Christian was nice enough to send me some samples. When I say samples, his actual product, it's in regular size, but to sample myself and try out. And I've been loving this stuff. And if you remember from the show when Christian was on several weeks ago now, I think it was, but he started this company, Longevity Power, and that's longevitypower.com, because what he found out from changing his life, changing the way he eats, and through supplementation, he's been able to change his physical health and his mental health in ways that were really unimaginable to him. So what do I have here? I have longevity adaptogens, which what I've been doing with these, interestingly enough, since I've been having my little bit of digestion issues dealing with some sort of bacteria, right after getting back from the Dominican Republic, could have been from the Dominican Republic, not sure, but I've been mixing these in with my greens that I take on a daily basis, these adaptogens here. And, definitely have noticed some benefits, a little reduction in stress, maybe a little more energy, and also supports the immune system and the adrenals. And it can be mixed into a smoothie, mixed into a beverage, any sort of powder mix that you're using. It's good stuff, and it's sourced well, trusted, of course. And then these other things I have here: Ancestral Feast and Thrive Beef Liver. So these are interesting. The Ancestral Feast, it's a Tex-Mex blend. Actually, either of these, the Thrive Beef Liver, you can mix these right into just burger meat, and you can turn your burger into, instead of just eating, a burger, which is just going to have the, the ground meat from a cow, obviously, from the normal regions of the animal, you can all of a sudden start eating nose to tail just by mixing in this powder, and it tastes delicious. You can also mix this into, any sauces or soups. Or the one thing I want to actually try is try each of these, just mixing them in with my existing bone broth that I'll have from time to time to see how that tastes. So definitely check this stuff out, longevitypower.com. Christian is a like-minded thinker. He's a libertarian. He loves freedom. He's an entrepreneur, and he's trying to better himself and help other people to better themselves, both physically and mentally. And then, of course, if you're listening to this show, spiritually, because today we're going to be talking about Christianity and liberty. So let's get to my guest right now. Let's introduce Doug Stuart. All right, we are live to the Lions of Liberty Pride. I'm joined here today by Doug Stuart. Doug is the CEO of the Libertarian Christian Institute. He holds a Master of Divinity from Missio, I think I'm saying that correctly, Seminary, and that was for his writing and speaking, focusing on challenging the status quo. Doug, like myself, is a Pennsylvania guy, although he's on the other side of the state, over in Lancaster. That's Lancaster, not Lancaster, Pennsylvania.
Yeah, right.
For those,
it's the only one in the country mispronounced.
Exactly. And where he freelances as a graphic designer and video producer. He's also served as a deacon at his evangelical church, where he has also taught classes on film culture, evangelicalism, faith, economics, and nonviolence. Doug, welcome to Finding Freedom.
Hey man, thanks for letting me come on. I was going to say thanks for joining me because I'm used to saying that to people on my show.
Yeah, great to have you here. I mean, we had a great conversation when I was on your show a few weeks ago. I really enjoyed that, and really wanted to bring you on here and get into your background, because what you've done with Libertarian Christian Institute, I think, is pretty remarkable. I mean, you've generated a pretty large audience, and maybe there's some misconception around really how many libertarians are Christians. I think it's a pretty large percentage. I don't know if anyone's researched that, but
yeah, I don't know what the actual numbers are. I think I did see something, kind of come across my desk a few months ago about, where Christians often, sort of identify politically. And, in the milieu that we have now, it does seem as though everybody wants to think in terms of left and right. And, you and I both know that that's not the only, way to think of politics and where people land in terms of how they would vote and what, sort of policies. But I think there are a lot of Christians who endorse a lot of what libertarianism has to say in terms of principles, but they're either afraid of, like, well, what if I vote for a candidate who wants to legalize drugs? They worry what that would mean to, the outcomes and whether or not that signals something about what they think about, like drug use and that kind of thing. So some on the right, they tend to be a little bit more fearful of, like, well, what are the ramifications of this? On the left, they probably are kind of like, well, yeah, we need freedom, and then they're like, but we need all these outcomes, and so they're probably a little bit less inclined to embrace libertarianism. But once you have conversations with them, you just have to break down the barriers of, like, here's exactly why something is not going to actually get you the end result that you want, and how liberty is going to actually do that.
Yeah, it's not it goes back to legislating, through morality. And as we know, there's a lot of pitfalls with that when the state is, we're trying to use our state to enforce what we think is good. So let's talk about Christianity first, your own background in Christianity, how you became a Christian. So what's your story?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what some people will theologically say about what I'm about to say. Is I feel like I've always been a Christian because I grew up in the church. I grew up believing in Christ. If there's any sort of profession of faith, I was about 5 years old, and it's never been changed since. I would just strongly suggest to people that my allegiance is to Christ, and that's the way it's always been. And obviously that can falter and waver and, come under doubt and that kind of thing. But I grew up in a pretty conservative environment. We voted when I say we, like the people around me and, that kind of thing. It was a really small community. They voted almost always Republican, except for maybe local elections where they knew the Democrat was a nice guy or something like that. And so my faith was I brought up mostly conservative. So there's that. I went to Bible college that was a little bit more in the direction of evangelicalism than, like, fundamentalism. And so that was eye-opening for me because I was exposed to a lot more diverse theological views within evangelicalism. And then when I went to, it was biblical seminary when I was attending it, but it's now Missio Seminary that you were mentioning there that I got my master's degree from. That exposed me to a lot of other denominations. Like in my cohort, there were Luther. I don't think there were any Catholics, but there were Lutherans, there were Reformed, there were pretty conservative people, there were African Methodist Episcopal, classmates, and they were all in there to do ministry. And so it was a very eclectic view, and I got exposed to a lot of that. So my Christian faith has always been a really important part of who I am. I can't imagine, I couldn't imagine being something else. So I don't know what that means per se, but there's a lot of in the past 20 years, there's been this sort of like emerging church deconstruction movement that a lot of, Christians who grew up in similar tradition that I grew up in.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of them are challenging things that I'm like, really? You got to challenge that? Like, I can understand that, you dealt with abuses or, and I don't mean extreme abuse, but like just even the sort of theological abuse of like, well, if you don't do this, God's going to, throw you in hell if you don't, if you don't save yourself for marriage or something, simple, legalistic like that. Right. I don't want to undermine or undercut or downplay people's, abuse history and things like that. But I never had to wrestle with it on that level, on a real personal level. And so I just could never see myself doing anything other than being a Christian and just finding new ways and fresh ways to understand my faith in a way that would promote the gospel and teach the gospel and live out the gospel in a variety of ways. And so for me, that also meant being somewhat politically active. And by the word political, I don't mean like partisan politics, but just having a robust understanding of what our relationship is with other individuals and, of course, with the state. So for me, I kind of went through that movement, the deconstruction / emergent church movement. I mean, in fact, the seminary I went to was very much engaged in like, well, what is this emergent church thing? What is postmodernism? How do we understand it? How do we minister to those who are growing up in it? And I did not come out a far leftist, which I can integrate the story of libertarianism at some point if you want to follow up anywhere there. You're welcome to there.
Yeah, well, let's keep going with that. So where did your introduction to the ideas of liberty occur? And was it something where it was a moment in time where it kind of sent you down a rabbit hole, or was it sort of slow integration?
Well, it's kind of funny for everybody. It starts with Ron Paul, but I often like to ask people like, who led you to Ron Paul, right? Like, and people will say, who led you to Jesus, or who led you to libertarian? It's like, who led you to Ron Paul?
That's a great question.
And you'd be surprised. For me, it's Glenn Beck. In the early aughts, I still have a weird awkwardness of saying that word, but anyway, I'm trying to adapt to it. In the early aughts, I was listening to, I left college, and I was starting to listen to talk radio. I had an XM radio subscription, and so I started listening to America Right and America Left, and I was listening to people like Sean Hannity. I even listened to his, counterpart back at the time, Allencompassing. He had his own show, and I listened to a lot of this radio, right? And then I got a job with a missions organization for a little under a year, but one of my coworkers was really into Glenn Beck when he was local in Philadelphia. And I loved his sense of humor. I loved, his take on things. Now, it was not soon after that he went and did what he is now known to be doing. It's like being
when he was local in Philadelphia, was he very political then? Because didn't he start out as just like a DJ? Or... Yeah,
no, he was just like your kind of local guy. I don't know. It wasn't a music station. It was a talk station. He had a talk show that was local, and I don't really remember. This is almost 20 years ago. So like, this is wild. This is before his CNN days, right?
Yeah.
And so, in any case, he just like, I loved his sense of humor. He had this, he and Stu were always like doing prank type stuff, and they were doing like, I don't know. It was the sense of humor. I got hooked on Glenn Beck, and then when he went to do like his national, he got syndicated and did he got big. It kind of faded away for me by around, I want to say 2006, 2007 for Glenn Beck. But here's why Glenn Beck led me to Ron Paul. Glenn Beck was a conservative, but he used the word libertarian, and he would say, I'm a libertarian at heart. And then when it came to things like the economy, he would have, when it came to things like the economy, and he had to talk about like the Federal Reserve or banking policy and all that, well, guess who he had on? He trusted Ron Paul to do all that. And so he would have Ron Paul on as a guest, and Ron Paul would talk about banking and economics. And I don't remember what I actually got out of those conversations per se, but when it came time for me later to come to the conclusion that, if I'm going to care about social justice, because remember, I went to a seminary that thought about social justice, we're thinking about the emerging church, we're like, hey, this isn't just about a private faith. I was like, yeah, wait a second. You guys are saying we need to just like raise the minimum wage and tax the wealthy more? That doesn't sound quite right. Need to learn some economics. Well, guess what? I learned that Ron Paul was good on like banking policy and how does economic policy affect humans, affect individuals. And so I decided to find out what Ron Paul would recommend, and I don't know exactly, what I did to dig that up, but it came to a book by Bob Murphy, who it was really a book about the New Deal and the Great Depression, but it had to do with understanding what happened and economic policy there. So we know that talks about the Federal Reserve and things like that. So that led me there, and then eventually I think I read a manifesto. And I also read some Milton Friedman, Free to Choose. I actually only recently remembered that I read Milton Friedman on a flight to Cambodia with my cohort. I didn't read it with them. I was with them on the flight. And I was reading. That would have been awesome. I remember reading Free to Choose and being like, yeah, this is me. This is where I am, right? So I guess you could say somewhat Milton Friedman, but it wasn't. It was through Ron Paul. It was through Glenn Beck, and then the last thing, of course, to fall for most conservatives is the whole war policy stuff. But by the time that rolled around, I was kind of like, oh, Ron Paul is right about all this war stuff. So that was my sort of gateway into libertarianism. And, of course, when you get into it via Ron Paul, you end up, imbibing a lot of Austrian economics and all of the Austrian denomination within libertarianism. I'll just call it that for fun.
Well, that's interesting. Sort of you were drawn, it sounds like you were drawn to libertarianism as a way you were seeking answers. You're talking with all these other leftists, your classmates who are saying we need to, raise the minimum wage, welfare, et cetera, et cetera. And it doesn't really check out what's the real answer.
Yeah.
I'm curious. Did you get a chance to interject some of those ideas that you'd learned, from Ron Paul, from Milton Friedman, and what kind of discussions occurred with your classmates?
Yeah, there was. It's interesting. I probably did it very poorly. I was in some ways in cage-staged libertarianism, although not quite as evangelical as a lot of people might have been. But I did interject into that, and I think at the time I wasn't able to separate a libertarian view with the conservative view of less government, right? The alleged conservative view of less government. Because especially in the 90s, and we're not even at that point, we're not even a decade out of the 90s. People still have in memory that the Republicans are supposed to be the party of small government, and of course you have the reputation of George W. Bush taking us to war, and at that time the left was actually against war. I think those conversations were tough for me because it's like, well, how do I differentiate in my own mind the difference between conservatism and libertarianism, because they overlapped in the mindset of people. But I'm trying to remember some of the conversation. I mean, we had lots of conversations. I don't know if I remember many of them. I do remember one, and this was actually a classmate of mine, sort of in his mind putting me in my place. He was much older. He had kids that were like, I don't know, half my age at the time. I was in my 20s, so he had like young teenage kids. And he said to me, we were driving back from our trip to Cambodia from the airport or whatever. I got a ride with him, and he was telling me, he goes, you can have all these views and stuff that you want, but at the end of the day, there are real people who are struggling, and you can't discount that they are being helped by some of these programs. And, again, I'm coming off as the cage stage guy who's like, this is all evil, blah, 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 blah. So he kind of put me in my place a little bit. And I've actually, that's actually stuck with me as a conversation. And I have formulated since then. I mean, again, this is 16 years ago. I have formulated responses to, if I were more mature, how I'd react to him. Although I guess if I could go back, he wouldn't have needed to chide me at all. But the story he told me was, I don't know how relevant this is, but the story he told me was that his mom was on welfare, and she went to, I guess she got a job or something, and she went to get either like food stamps or some sort of support or whatever, and apparently she made $1 more than for the cutoff. And the lady was like, yeah, you make too much, and like by $1, but she is clearly in need of help, right?
Right.
And she's like, all right, well then I just quit my job. I make nothing. And that there is that he was reminding me that he grew up where he was, his life was better because of, I guess, food stamps or whatever. And I do try to, as best I can, battle the system that enables poverty to keep perpetuating, while at the same time realizing that like you can't have nothing good come of it, right? Like Bob Murphy actually said to me at one point, I kind of asked him about this probably a few years after that conversation, that if we think of positive policies or positive things that happen in the world and they have negative externalities, well, you can't expect that things that are on net negative won't have some small positive externalities in that regard. So I was like, all right, fine. I can work with that. And so I think that's why I'm not really a libertarian purist, because I think at the end of the day, I don't want to call myself an incrementalist because that could get me in trouble. I don't mean it that way, but in the sense of like, well, we can only win so many battles at a time. And so there might be an opportunity in the future where there is something a little bit more akin to an American Revolution or a revolution of some kind of liberty. But until that seems obvious and nonviolent, we got to work with what we have.
Yeah, and I think what I've come to realize over the years of being a libertarian is that often we try to fit the people we're talking to into the same box that we identify as being a libertarian, as what liberty is. And liberty to someone else might look entirely different. Like for someone like me, like maybe my ideal liberty is I want to be on a farm and I want to raise, my own crops and have some animals and chickens. And maybe for someone else that's terrifying, and they want to be in an apartment building surrounded by people, and they want to have, community support. So I think we have to be careful with that as libertarians, as thinking everybody wants that, that same thing as,
no, I agree. There are people who have different desires from us. I mean, I have a close friend of mine who would rather have like kind of what you described. It's like, well, no, I'd rather have this support and I'd be happy to pay taxes on it or pay taxes to make that happen. Another thing that that was important for me becoming a libertarian was that my heart for becoming a libertarian was very much changed by listening to, I don't know if you remember Freedom Watch with Shepard Smith and Judge Napolitano. It was an XM. It was a podcast that was on in the middle, late afternoon. I think it was on XM radio.
There was a show. Didn't he have a show on Fox Business?
Well, he did, but then he and Shep Smith did their show. Well, that was emotionally shifting for me, which was basically, hey, there's this family in New Hampshire who's driving around and living in this van or whatever, and they can't now because of permits or something like that. I don't know if it was New Hampshire. It might have been Oregon, probably Oregon, not New Hampshire. New Hampshire, they're probably allowed to do that, but or well, maybe back then they weren't. I don't know. I distinctly remember in my yard where I was mowing, and I kind of paused listening to this story. And I don't have the details, but it was an emotionally compelling story as to why the state was screwing individuals, these particular individuals who were doing nothing to harm anybody. And I think those are just the stories that we hear that drive us to realize that the state isn't all that we think it ought to be. The deromanticization of our affinity for this all-controlling state apparatus. And people want to use the word government. I've shifted to saying state because it gets people to realize it. I never say public schools. I say government schools. And I used to be like, oh, well, that's what everybody else calls it. I'll just call it what everybody else is. And I'm like, no, it's not. Corey DeAngelis convinced me that it's not actually public. So why am I calling it that?
Yeah, that's probably a fair shift. Just a funny aside. You were talking about, you remember where you were cutting the grass, and you heard that. There were so many things I have like that, because when I'm outside working in my garden or cutting the grass, I'm always listening to podcasts. And it'll be like, as I'm replanting something the next year, I remember 2 years ago when I was planting these flowers here, and I was listening to Joe Rogan talking to Graham Hancock, and it's so. Oh my
word! So you associate Joe Rogan with a particular flower and his outrage with a particular action in planting that flower. Yeah, no, I totally get it, and it was emotional for me because I paused, and I was just like, this is terrible. Like, people have to know that this is not that their romantic view of the state is just not great. That is, it ought to be cynically challenged. So yeah, that's where that was an emotional shift for me. Yeah.
So we talked about your background in becoming a Christian, your background in liberty. So where did the Libertarian Christian Institute come from? What's the origin story there?
Yeah. So let's see, the timing of this at this point, I would say that everything that I've shared so far has led up to around 2008, 2009. And at the time, I'm in seminary, and I was really baffled why my classmates were like, well, not all of them, but some of them were like rah for Barack Obama. And I had a blog at the time. It doesn't even exist anymore unless you went through Web Archive, and I'll let people do that if they want to. But I kind of, blogged blog wars with the wife of one of my classmates about her support for Barack Obama back in 2007, 2008. And at the time, so this is like during the time of Obama gaining all this steam, you have a lot of Christians wondering, well, why? People like me wondering, well, why is that, and why do they want to do that? And it's very, you and I could probably recognize that there's a very similar aspirational reason why Barack Obama was liked and endorsed and embraced in the same way that the right embraced Trump, or the sort of MAGA conservative type embraced Trump. There's a lot of similarities there. There's, the whole Messiah figure kind of thing, like, oh, they're going to rescue us from the muck that is the U.S. politics, right? So at the same time, and unbeknownst to me, Norman Horn, who is the founder of the Libertarian Christian Institute, was also doing very similar things. Now, he was not battling this from the like, hey, I'm sort of becoming a left-leaning in my theology, but their politics doesn't, like, he wasn't going through all of that. He was shifting out of conservatism, just like I was, a different kind of conservatism in terms of theology, for sure, but a sort of conservative political leaning. You should just have him on to tell you his story in particular. But it was around late 2008 that libertarianchristians.com was founded by Norman. And he just started blogging. It was a personal blog. And that happened for about a year or so, and I somehow stumbled upon it. I often joke that, Norman beat me to the URL by about 6 months. Otherwise, I could have been the one who founded libertarianchristians.com. And that, honestly, that's not far from the truth, even though it's a joke. I probably thought, oh, maybe I should get libertarianchristians.com. Oh, wait, it already exists. Oh, wait, there's this guy named Norman Horn. And so we developed a friendship in late 2009, and around 2010, I became sort of a regular contributor. He had a handful of bloggers on there. And then over the course of the next few years, we just wrote stuff, and I would write. Norman would, be the editor, so to speak. Well, not so to speak. He would be the editor. And by around 2013, there was a need for a sort of conference. And so we held the first Christians for Liberty conference in 2014 in Austin, Texas. And around that time, there was also a suggestion by some people at the Missio Institute that Norman was close with, as like, hey, you might be able to gain some momentum and some steam here if you incorporate as a nonprofit. Is that the right word? Incorporate as a nonprofit? Yeah. So we pursued that, and in 2015, and I think it was like record time. I think it was, I don't know, it was like super fast. We got status for 501c3. And Norman was kind of like, well, this is proof that God exists, because even under the Obama administration, the Libertarian Christian Institute could incorporate very quickly. He said that. So we announced that at the 2015 conference that we had, and then we did another one in 2016. I wasn't able to be a part of that because it was my anniversary and I was in another country. Anyway, so the founding of the Libertarian Christian Institute came about through Norman starting a blog, building a blog, a handful of writers, and then that becoming an institute in 2015. We had to kind of, create a logo and do some things like that. It was at that point, it's not like we had a lot of funding, but we were able to just start a board of directors, and we had some key people on there. So I was a key part of LCI, LCC, libertarianchristians.com, in the sort of parallel of LouRockwell.com nomenclature there, or acronyms. And so I was just part of the board. And over the years it grew, and we had an executive director for a while. He's actually still on our board. And at, I think it was 2018, I became CEO to lead in content development. And so my primary role, although a lot of CEOs have a lot of, wear a lot of hats, as it were, have a lot of irons in the fire, my primary responsibility is to make sure that our content is high quality and gets out there frequently and regularly.
So how many different podcasts are there now on the network?
Yeah, no, that's really good. Good question. I always forget the number because there's one that's sort of like an archive, sort of like it's there as a legacy. It's the Godarchy podcast. I think there's 7. So there's the flagship podcast, which is a Libertarian Christian Podcast. That's the one you joined me on. And we released that in 2017. We're over 300 episodes now. We do it weekly. There's always unique content. We've never done a replay unless it's a bonus episode. We've never taken an old episode and made it oh, we don't have something this week, we're gonna just throw this one in. As much as I've been able to do that for what now, 6 years. I've been able to say we've never done that. So I got to keep that up.
That's honestly, that stat probably puts you in the top 1% of podcasts.
Yeah. Well, what I will do, I cheat a little bit in the sense that I'm probably going to email you and say, hey, John, can I repeat our episode that we're having right now?
Sure.
But if everybody were listening to just my episodes, they would all be unique. That doesn't mean they hadn't heard this conversation before. Or if we have speaking engagements and that kind of thing, we'll use that as content. But anyway, so in 2022, we were at Freedom Fest in July, which was in Vegas. And after that, we had a board meeting, and we were all talking about different things about how we want to plan for the following. And we started following years, we started realizing that there's a lot of demand for audio content and video content, and there's a lot of talent out there that we can utilize that could give us that we could partner with to give us an additional amount of content and also reach a wider audience. So you probably know, Finding Freedom is a great name for a podcast, John, because it doesn't have the baggage of the word libertarian. It has the word freedom. So you're going to attract a certain type of person who wants to be free. And then, but the Libertarian Christian Podcast is quite narrow in one sense. So for people who already know what that word means, or those words mean, and that phrase means, they're going to be attracted to it, and we want people to listen. And we have a pretty big listener audience. But we also want people who are just simply into biblical stuff. So we have Jacob Winograd, who just commented a little bit ago on this in our comments here. Jacob Winograd is the Biblical Anarchy podcast. Yeah, there he is.
Jacob says it's never too early for Jesus.
Yeah, I think he said that when I was talking about how I was always a Christian or something. That was the remark at the time.
Or maybe he was talking about the time in the day. It's 10 a.m. It's early, but it's never too early for Jesus.
Oh, maybe that's true. You were doing that. So in any case, we have the Biblical Anarchy podcast. I am not a Reformed Libertarian, but we have Kerry Baldwin and Gregory Baus, who have the Reformed Libertarians podcast. They are doing an excellent job explaining and expositing and exploring what it looks like to be a Reformed Libertarian Christian. We have a book that we came out with in 2020. This is what we did when we were all stuck at home. We have a book here. I'm holding it up for those watching. Called Faith Seeking Freedom. This is, I think, John, you probably have a copy. There's 4 of us who wrote answers to 102 questions that are answered in about 250 words each. So this is stuff that in theory you can memorize, but of course what we want is for Christians to be able to have answers for the tough questions that they get. And so that's a great book for that for people to use. And because we realized that we can't answer every question, we started a podcast called Faith Seeking Freedom Podcast. And so we released that. Ideally, we release it every week, but what happens is there's a whole slew of questions that come in, and then Norman records all the answers, and then we spread it out, and so it kind of is on an as the questions come in basis. So send us your questions, podcast@libertarianchristians.com, if you have a question for a Libertarian Christian, and so there's probably about 50 episodes. I mean, we started that late last year, so it wasn't it hasn't been around too long. We have another show called Good News, Bad News. It was a roundtable in sort of the spirit of the Reason Roundtable format. And what we did was we shifted it to Matt Bellis, who is far more entertaining than just listening to four of us talk. He writes them out, and we use teleprompter and produces them, and it's sort of the Dave Rubin style. Hey, I'm going to tell you about what's happening in the libertarian analysis. And it's also a little bit of there's a little bit of Daily Show-esque humor going on in there. And because I apparently have a tendency to have technical difficulties whenever we have internal team meetings, we're actually playing into the technical difficulties that we sometimes have when we do the show, like on St. Patrick's Day, Matt wore a green sweater. That doesn't work well when there's a green screen behind him. So we just had to apologize and draw attention to it and make it funny. So
that's funny.
That kind of stuff. So we have that. And then most recently, we brought on Mike Meharry, who did the Godarchy podcast. He's got a boatload of episodes that we have in the backlog that are out there. So he's part of the Christians for Liberty Network. And then Alex Bernardo, who is our newest podcast. Now, he's been around for about a year now, but he joined us in March, first episode in March, the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. Now, what he does is he explores Protestantism and libertarianism, and most of the time, not every single episode, but most of the time, the topics converge. And he talks about something that converges. Like sometimes he'll just talk about some issues that are more theological, and sometimes that are some that are just very explicitly libertarian. But he's not anti-Catholic. So for those who might hear Protestant think, oh, it's gonna just be about that. He's not anti-Catholic. He's just he's a Protestant in the sense of that's who he identifies as. So Alex Bernardo is the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. And I really hope I didn't forget any. I could probably look at it online here, but it'd be distracting. So
I didn't realize that people assumed the Protestants were anti-Catholic. I was raised Protestant.
That's what the word means. Yeah. So, I mean, it's kind of the origin, but it's it doesn't really mean that. I mean, that's what the word started as meaning.
Okay.
Words don't have meaning. Words have usage, and that's how we often use it. So,
yeah, that's true. So I had a question for you.
Yeah.
I've heard this said before, and I don't necessarily agree with it, but I've heard it said that libertarianism is Christianity without Christ. I don't know if you've heard that before, and what your thoughts are on that.
I might have, but I don't know if I paid it serious attention. What do you think they mean by that? What is the implication?
I don't know. I mean, I think they mean that it gives you sort of some of the principles of Christianity,
I see.
Without having, actually Christ is dying for your sins and giving you that avenue to God. But it's still, libertarianism is giving you the not really the moral compass on earth, but it's telling you, not to hurt other people. Sort of the golden rule: treat others as you would like to be treated. Like an anonymous
Christ, but it doesn't name him, kind of thing.
Sort of, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I would actually make that accusation against the woke religion, because there's not only is it without Christ, because it had there's literally no redemption in their religion. There's no way. It's just perpetual penance, and heaping ashes upon oneself if you're white. Christianity without Christ. I think what people are probably getting at to that is that, and this is the mistake that a lot of Christians who don't embrace libertarianism think about libertarianism, is that they think it's a all-encompassing worldview. And I'm using that whole phrase because that's what Al Mohler did when he debated Norman Horn about 8 years ago on it was probably a 20-minute episode with Julie Roys. I forget the actual name of the episode, or the show, which has now been discontinued. But she interviewed Norman, or had a discussion between Norman and Al Mohler, who's president of the Southern Baptist Seminary. He wanted libertarianism to be an all-encompassing worldview because that way he could reject it. And it is not. In fact, we actually say that in a way, libertarianism, John, you probably know that soteriology is the doctrine of salvation and ecclesiology is the doctrine of the church. And so we would see as our view of politics being libertarian as one of those segments of theology. So how does the church think about angels, it's called angelology. How does how do Christians think about the church? It's ecclesiology. How do Christians think about politics? We don't have an ology that we've come up with, or we've tried to come up with something that's more catchy, but it's politicalology, whatever. Like, that's where we fit that in to be consistent in your Christian faith. For those who are into like systematic theology, those things kind of have to work together and be compatible with one another. And so we feel like if you were a libertarian, this would be your most, you'd be the most consistent Christian in your thinking if you adopted libertarianism as opposed to, you know, conservative political values or left-leaning political values. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And I think you made a really good point at the beginning that really, I think that does align more with the woke, the woke culture, in that there is no redemption. There's just suffering, really.
Yeah.
There's no way out. And it's a bleak outlook. And I don't know, I'm curious to get your opinion on where you see really that going, and where you see this sort of culture war that I think has been reignited in the past couple of years here. How you kind of envision this playing out?
Oh man, I don't want to depress your listeners. We're almost done here. I mean, this is, I have to say, I have my moments of despair, and I don't mean that in like, I just think I'm not black pilled. I am, for the most part, white pilled. I wish there were a purple pill, by the way, just saying that out there. Nobody talks about the purple pill. Anyway,
what would the purple pill be?
Well, I don't know, but there's a red pill, there's a blue pill, there's a white pill, and there's a black pill, and us libertarians are like, where's the purple pill? Anyway, we can workshop that sometime. So where do I see this going? Positively, I think it will wake people up. Ironically, that's a funny way to say that, of course. In that, I don't believe people paid attention to the culture wars, because I think, I should say, the moderate Christian and the moderate American probably didn't pay attention to the culture wars because it became an embattled situation. And so what I mean by that is you're always going to have your people who are on the right fighting the culture war because, well, we need to either take America back for Jesus, or we just need to preserve our ability to say that homosexuality is a sin, right? Like, you're going to have, like, we don't want our church being non-profited. It's not a word, but I just made it up, so it is. We don't want our church to lose nonprofit status just because the preacher says something, right? So you're always going to have that crowd, and they exist for a reason, and they serve a certain purpose. You're also going to have people on the left who are going to be pushing things in a certain direction, and you're also going to have those people use the term culture war as an epithet against those who actually are calling out things that are going wrong in society. And so I think James Lindsay does a really good job of pointing out the tactics. And I don't think there's a way to see this any other way. I mean, there is, but I think it's pretty clear that here's what happens. You do something that then gets a reaction out of people, and maybe an overreaction. And then what you do is you draw attention to the overreaction as if that's irrational, or to the reaction as if that's an overreaction or irrational. So what you'll see by those on the left is you'll see the memes posted that say, Ron DeSantis says this about trans people, but that's not what's really happening, right? And so they use that as fuel to say, look at how crazy out there these people, they're kind of painting them as conspiracy theorists or as the extreme, even when they're literally saying, no, in this city, like they're stating facts, right? And that the reaction is overblown, and that, oh, well, we don't want that. We're not groomers, we're not this or that. I just got you kicked off of YouTube if you're on it, but just by saying the word, we're not that. And there's that sort of Mott and Bailey tactic where they just kind of retreat to the safe position and say, well, no, that's not what we're doing. But they're also using the idea that there is a backlash against some stuff that the left is out there producing or out there asking for. And some of it is actually nonviolent and okay if it's voluntary. And I don't mean the things I just said, but some of those things just happen to be like, well, okay, you live and let live. You are in San Francisco. We expect you to behave that way. So they're using the reaction to instigate instigate intolerance against that kind of reaction. And so that will be used to actually to oppress or repress or suppress the intolerance of what they would call radical tolerance. So I might be using that term wrongly, but in any case, how do I see this playing out? I think we have to be very, very wise at how we react to the woke religion. I think in some regard there's a very real presence that is, I don't know what everybody thinks of demons and whether or not they're like real and invisible out there doing things, but whatever one's theology is about demons.
I believe in demons.
Okay. So whatever one's theology is about demons, there is something going on out there. And I don't think you can explain any of this without that, because I don't believe that there is this conspiracy by the left, by the woke left, by the transgender. I don't see that as like like back in the 90s, there was this vast right-wing conspiracy as a thing, right? There was that phrase out there that I think it was Hillary Clinton who popularized it. Oh, there's this, the right thinks there's this vast conspiracy. I don't go down that road. I think that there are just a lot of players and there's a zeitgeist that is pushing people in a certain direction, and those things are being corrupted and they're being influenced in the way that we would ascribe to demons and to the Satan, to the devil. And so even James Lindsay tweeted that he did like a whole day-long study of demons and stuff, and he's like, well, I don't believe in God or demons, but like this totally helps explain things. Like this is a way to explain what's happening. I'm like, geez, guy, come on.
Open up a little bit. Come on.
So there it is. We need to pray. We need to be wise. Was it the phrase that Jesus said, wise as serpents and harmless as doves? We need to do that. I do believe there is room to listen to those who are on. I don't mean to be pejorative when I talk about the woke religion, because just like any person, they could just be caught up in it without realizing it. Some people are activists and they know what they're doing. Some people truly know how deceptive it is and they get a kick out of the power trip or whatever. But there are people who are into things that they don't realize that it's dangerous, and we can have compassion on them. There are people who are at risk. There are transgender individuals who are physically at harm and at risk due to discrimination and due to hatred, bigotry. Like, bigotry does exist. I'm okay saying that. That doesn't mean that it explains everything. That doesn't mean that just because somebody doesn't want you to have certain rights or different rights or some special, allowances or whatever, that they're a bigot. So we have to be careful there. But I think it's okay to have compassion and pursue ways in which we can listen to the other side, because if all we're going to do is join up on this side when this side is in large part hurting and in pain, then we're not actually going to make this end well. Maybe we'll have a national divorce and peacefully done, but I don't know if that's necessarily a positive outcome. I think it's a legit outcome. It might be good, but it's not a guarantee that it is.
Yeah, I think, and I was going to say my greatest fear. I'm not sure if it's my greatest fear, but a fear that I have is really the response to the woke religion from the right. And, these things do act like pendulums and they swing back and forth. We do have to be very, very careful in how we respond and how we resist. Really, what is occurring with these demons that are acting out in our world today.
I have one thing to say to that, and the reason that I got into understanding the woke left, two reasons. One is John McWhorter wrote a book about it, and I read everything by John McWhorter because he's a linguist and I really like him. But the other thing was, I keep hearing, this is about 2-3 years ago, the right, like politicians on the right, were just going crazy and making what it seemed to be overblown reactions to one school doing something that, like had drag queens come in for the library or whatever, right? and that they called it an epidemic of, transgender activism and all that. And I'm like, all right, are they really overblowing this? And so, I looked into it and understanding this, and it led me down to, understanding and looking into critical theory, critical race theory. Some Christians on the left that I trust, we're talking about critical race theory as if it's, just a field of study in the same way that you might study psychology or economics or whatever. And I'm like, oh, okay. And that, again, the whole idea that as soon as someone says critical race theory and you're a person who's on the right, the person on the left is going to say, you don't even know what that is. And no, we're not teaching it, and no, and all that. And so it just basically, it puts them in a position for them to legitimately react to the overreaction. Right. And so I'm kind of like, all right, I'm pretty sure that Ron DeSantis is not, somebody like Mitch McConnell is not steeped in understanding critical race theory. He saw one little thing. Somebody on his staff said, wow, this is critical race theory. Use that word because that's going to galvanize the right. And it does. And I'm kind of like, nah, this isn't the right way to look at this. So I looked into it, and it turns out that they're probably not quite that overblown. But at the same time, it's the reaction, like you said, is just, it's going to be dangerous. So I can understand why people want to call it fascism for Ron DeSantis to try to do some of the things that he's wanting to do in Florida. I realize that he's trying to, elbow his way in front of the line for presidency, but yeah, I think libertarians have a really great opportunity to dispel the myths on both sides, and also to, I wouldn't say bridge the gap, but at least be the kinds of people that will listen to and hear out with compassion those who are actually struggling. So
add some rational thinking to the discussion.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
That's exactly
all right. So
what I meant to say.
We do have to get to the bonus section here. Before we do that, Doug, if you could just once again plug the podcast, the website, anything else that you're working on.
Yeah, so there's two places you can go. You can go to libertarianchristians.com. Our homepage is going to tell you all about the Christians for Liberty Network, which is not the only thing we do. I know that's kind of what we all talked about. You can also go to christiansforliberty.net. But libertarianchristians.com has hundreds of articles that are all about the topics that we've talked about today, and also, ones that are pretty, seminal in the origin of, Norman and me coming to become libertarians. There's a whole bunch of stuff on nationalism. For any of you out there who are going to attend Freedom Fest this summer of 2023 in Memphis, we are going to be there. Not only are we going to be there, we are going to be on a main stage event as a panel discussion talking about the threat of nationalism to flourishing. And we're doing a breakout session on Christian nationalism. So we are tackling the nationalism angle head on. We're doing episodes on it right now. We're writing some reviews of some of the important, I don't want to say it's important, but the sense that it's become important because people like the book. Important book by Stephen Wolfe on the case for Christian nationalism. We're writing reviews on that and episodes. So that's the kind of thing that we're doing. And then, of course, I held up the book, which is now a coaster for my mug right now. Faith Seeking Freedom, which you can get on libertarianchristians.com, or you can get it at faithseekingfreedom.com.
Awesome. Doug Stuart, thanks for coming on Finding Freedom.
Thank you, John.
All right. Hopefully you guys enjoyed that show. And I'm speaking correctly now, being from Pittsburgh, saying you guys and not you all. I don't know what that was at the top of the show, but hopefully you enjoyed the interview with Doug. Just an awesome guy. So often you do run across people that you go on their show or they come on your show, and there is just sort of a natural conversational flow that is easy. And I found that I have that with Doug. And if you enjoyed this interview, I did do another 15 minutes or so bonus with Doug Stuart that you can hear by becoming a patron of Lions of Liberty by going to patreon.com/Lions of Liberty or lionsofliberty.locals.com. I asked Doug about, what else does he do other than this liberty and this Christianity stuff, to dig a little deeper, peeling the layers back, and also ask some really interesting, thought-provoking questions. And I think maybe his answers might surprise you. So definitely check that out. And also, you can see I am wearing my retro, if you're watching on YouTube, my retro No Victim, No Crime, No Victim, No Time Felony Friday shirt. You can still pick these up in the Lions of Liberty store. At least I think you can. I need to double check that. But go check it out. Of course, we do have newer designs. We have Finding Freedom shirts as well. You can get your Mean Age Daydream shirts also. So check out the Lions of Liberty store. That's at lionsofliberty.store. And I think I'm remembering there's something else that I wanted to talk about. Oh, yes. I almost forgot. So last week I said I was going to play my episode when I was on Doug's show on my Finding Freedom solo feed. But I thought to myself, John, that's stupid. You should play it after you interview Doug on your Finding Freedom solo feed. So that's what I'm going to do. You're going to hear my interview. You already heard my interview with Doug. It just happened. If you want to hear my interview on Doug's show, if you're listening on Monday, the 22nd, on the 23rd, Tuesday, I'll be publishing that in my Finding Freedom solo feed, so you can check that out. And that's it, guys. Hope you enjoyed the show. Hopefully you're enjoying the start to spring, getting outside, soaking in the rays, all that good stuff. Hopefully the weather by you has been bright and shiny, and you're enjoying just enjoying the change from the doldrums of winter, which being in Western PA, it is a welcome change. So I'll talk to you all next week. Everyone have a great week, and always remember to keep your head up and the fires of liberty burning.